Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So this is another Zoom session, but I'm sure that this one will work perfectly. We checked everything. The sound was good. The picture was good. Everything was working. Today with us, we have Manos Antoninis, who's the Director of Global Education Monitoring Report at UNESCO. And as most of you know, we have participated in Global Education Monitoring Report work previously, actually on 2 occasions when we were doing the regional report on inclusion and education. And then we also helped with non-state actors report. So we're happy that we've made this partnership with the GEM report and with Manos himself. Manos, thank you very much. He's joining us from Bangkok. And it seems that it's a better connection, Bangkok Tirana than UK Tirana. This is something that we can tell you. And since we're using technology and we're talking about technology, I'm sure we can discuss all the issues of what happens when technology doesn't help us. Manos, thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass the floor. You can start. I can just tell you that you're competing from the outside of the square. We're in Tirana International Hotel, and the outside on the square, the choir has just started singing. So, so that's what we are, in which situation we are in. Thank you for joining us, Manos. I give the floor to you.
Thank you, and you bring this memory of my first visit to Tirana International Hotel was quite dramatic, because the moment I arrived, the whole scaffolding collapsed. But that was 20 years ago. A pleasure to be with you. I don't know. I can only say you, Lana. So I don't know who exactly I'm addressing. Not that it makes a huge difference, but it does make me feel a little bit more wonderful. Thank you so much. It's okay. Still, at least I get a good sense. A warm welcome to from also greetings from me from the other end of the world, and it is a pleasure really to be talking to you about our work, given the wonderful collaboration history we've had. But some of you may still not quite know what the GEM report is. We are the tool of the international community to monitor progress on education. And we have 2 mandates. First, to monitor each target of SDG 4 and also education finance. So there's half of the report is a monitoring part. But then we also have a mandate to monitor progress on the implementation of national and international strategies to achieve SDG 4. And for that reason, our advisory board selects a theme. And the theme this year was technology in education. So I'm going to basically take you through the main findings, and I will at some point go a little bit more in depth on the issues of well-being. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So let me start by sharing my screen. Here it is. So, as you know, technology is a challenging topic. In fact, we found that it generated more passion and tensions than even other, in my view, perhaps potentially more sensitive topics like inclusion, like migration, like accountability, like private schools. Still, people have very strong views about technology in education, and yet most of these issues do cause tensions. There are those who see in technology the opportunity to democratize access to knowledge, and those who worry that more and more these channels to knowledge are being and to information are controlled by fewer people. We see, in addition, the fact that we believe that education opens new opportunities, and yet others are really concerned that our future may become so dependent on technology that we may not be able to come back from that. There are those who would like to see children being more exposed to technology so that they can navigate the digital world from a young age, and others who are really concerned about the implications of that, and so on and so forth. Now, from our perspective, we have a mandate which is monitoring progress and looking at factors that can help accelerate progress on education, at least in terms of the way SDG 4 has defined them. And in that sense, for many of the world's poorer countries, it is difficult to argue that technology is a prerequisite, because rich countries were at the stage of and a level of education development already 30 years ago that most poorer countries would aspire to today, and yet the richer countries were there without digital technology. It was before the advent of digital technology. So it is possible to achieve, but these targets without technology, and yet we also know that the world is changing rapidly. So the definition of what is the technology, the education we're aspiring to, changes. So that was one major challenge. The other major challenge we had is that technology is, of course, changing very, very rapidly. One statistic that is striking is the number of young people enrolled and adults in massive open online courses has grown to more than 200 million, which is almost equivalent to the number of people enrolled in tertiary education in basically just a little bit over 10 years. And that number even excludes China. But sometimes that's a number that refers to higher education. Sometimes we tend to perhaps think too much that education is being transformed by technology. To some extent, it hasn't. Even though this graph here dates just before COVID, still, it's important to know that it comes from PISA, so it refers to upper middle and high income countries, and it shows the percentage of children or students, 15-year-olds, who had digital devices used for more than an hour a week in their mathematics and science lessons. And as you see, only 10% of students had that, even in the world's richest countries. 3 countries are at the very top, right? Denmark, Sweden, and Australia. Maybe some of you may have heard were about a third. In Denmark, I think as high as half of the students. But maybe some of you may have heard that in Sweden, there has been now serious thinking to move out of that policy and limit the use of digital devices in schools. So education, perhaps it's fair to say, has not yet been transformed because its use varies so much by income, by education level, by the level of teachers' preparedness, and of course by resources. Only half of the schools in the world claim to be connected to the internet for pedagogical purposes, and we know that that already exaggerates the use of internet in even these schools that are connected. Often it's not used for education. So as I mentioned, children can and do learn without technology. And the big question we need to ask is, can technology solve key education challenges? The report identifies challenges related to equity and inclusion, to quality, and to efficiency, and reminds ourselves that often we forget to ask this important question. We tend to ask, how can we apply technology, even though that technology may not have even been designed for education. Education changes very, very fast. One estimate says that there's a new product every 3 years, and that means that's basically even shorter than the cycle of research. So what happens in practice is that technology is adopted with very little evidence. Even in a country like the United Kingdom, less than 1 in 5 products had been subject to any research study, and much, much fewer of these products were subject to rigorous studies. So technology is being adopted without it, and often the little evidence that exists is generated by the actors who are actually trying to sell it, the technology providers. Sometimes in a few cases where independent assessments have been carried out, the findings have been contradicted. So good impartial evidence and the lack of it are another challenge when we try to assess the impact of technology in education. Let us also not forget that that impact is not just about evaluating a particular product or service. It's much broader, and its implications are quite hard to assess. Let's take the three main problems in education, starting with equity. Technology does offer a lifeline to millions, but ends up also excluding many more. Even mature technologies like radio and television historically have helped millions of learners to be reached. Mexico is an example where television-based education increased enrollment in secondary education by 18%, which is a massive amount. Very few technologies today can be credited with such dramatic impact. Technology also transforms education experiences of learners with disabilities. In fact, that's probably the most important influence, the most positive influence that technology does have, although there are a lot of complications that I'm sure you are more familiar with the use of some of these technologies in practice and the labeling that may come with them. It can also help in emergencies. We know how it helps currently in Ukraine, for instance, and no emergency was as dramatic as the COVID-19 pandemic and the school closures. It coincided with the period when the right to education was becoming already increasingly equivalent to the right to meaningful connectivity. And yet we found out that not only internet was not available, but even other forms of distance education were not available. In fact, 3/4 of the poorest had no chance to any distance learning, not just online, but also through radio and television. Another dimension of equity is access to content. Content has grown, and that's of course one of the things that we tend to benefit and enjoy most about technology, the opportunity to have knowledge at the tip of our fingers. And it also helps content to be created in a very creative way, so it can be adapted, can be accessed and distributed relatively easily, and it can drastically reduce costs. For instance, textbooks, when you can access them online if the infrastructure helps. But we should also not forget that the content is huge, is difficult to curate, and it's also mainly produced by a few countries and a few languages. 92% of the Open Education Resource Commons content is in English, to give an example. And there is talk of digital sovereignty, how countries can exercise their ability to change the content and adapt it to their own needs. But that's a very, very difficult and costly exercise, and very few countries go through that process. The higher education sector is the one that has adopted technology the fastest and the most. But maybe some of you are already familiar with the difficulties that the use of platforms are bringing as they challenge the university's role through the way students now become essentially clients of some of these platforms. That's a major issue. I won't go into detail, but it's one that is a growing concern. In terms of quality, no one denies that today's basic skill set has to include a measure of digital literacy, and I will come to that later on. But knowing about technology is not the same as learning through technology. That second relationship needs to be proven. And practically, the report argues that we cannot apply a blanket assumption that all technologies are good in themselves. Some technologies improve some types of learning in some contexts. So technology can increase, as we saw, access to resources. It can fill quality gaps. It can increase practice time for some repetitive tasks. It can personalize instruction, which has advantages up to a certain limit. It can help engage some students, at least as long as the novelty holds and stands. But it can also be detrimental if used too much. the report drew attention to the fact that 1/4 of countries are now banning the use of mobile phones in schools and classrooms out of a concern that it is distracting and in fact it's not really helping teachers teach. And another major concern is that there has been historically a focus on digital inputs, but not on whether these inputs can improve learning outcomes. Millions of laptops were distributed, particularly through the well-known one laptop per child or one tablet per child program, and yet practically all of these programs were found to have no impact because no thought had been put to how these resources would be used in the classroom. And the report also notes that it does not need to be advanced technology to be effective. Just as I was mentioning television earlier, China had recorded lessons by good teachers that were transmitted and supported in classroom by rural teachers who were not very good, but at least had this additional support through these broadcast lessons. And analysis found out, and that was a program that covered 100 million rural primary and secondary school students. And then research 10 to 15 years later found that it had reduced the urban-rural learning gap by as much as a third, which is another striking finding about how a very simple technology, if well thought and if responding to a specific problem, in this case, the quality of rural teachers, can have really dramatic effects. In terms of efficiency, there are many potential applications, especially for countries with complex geographies or difficulties in training teachers. We find that distance teacher education can be very a good solution. We know that online coaching, for instance, is not as effective as face-to-face coaching, but examples from some of the world's poorer countries show that it can be more than 80% more cost-effective, and therefore it makes it worth it. There are a lot of opportunities that are opening from computer-based and computer-adaptive assessments, especially as they generate masses of data analytics that could improve feedback. And yet at the same time, we forget how limited the capacity of administrators and teachers is to process and use this data for their own work, how data sets are often not integrated, how privacy becomes a major concern, and how some algorithms that have been developed to use these data actually end up compromising the education trajectories of some of the very children that they are set out to help. Technology is often bought because the idea is that it's going to save money. And yet, the report finds many other examples that suggest that this is not the case. For instance, the United States is, of course, a major source of evidence because it's the country where technology has been applied to a very large extent. Only 11% of administrators and teachers requested peer-reviewed evidence before they adopted technology. And what is perhaps even more striking is that 2/3 of education software licenses were not used, represents a major wastage. And essentially, for many of these cases, so many conditions need to be in place for efficiencies to be made. In reality, the investment in technology as things stand is usually an additional cost. The report estimates that even very simple technical solutions in the world's poorest countries will do nothing else but increase the financing gap by 50%, and these countries already lack so many important resources, teaching and learning resources. The report has reviewed education systems, their laws and policies in more than 200 countries, basically in all countries and all education systems in the world. You can find this information on the PEER website, and I will just report a few data, a few interesting statistics from there. First and foremost, as you see, above only 16% of countries guarantee data privacy in education with a law. And some analysis, in fact, finds that even where such law is in place, still children's rights are not protected. Schools still collect a lot of data on education, and it's only in Europe, thanks to the General Data Protection Regulation, where data protection officers have to be hired and carry out this task, that there has been at least some progress, and maybe that has influenced some thinking also in the rest of the world. There are important safety risks. Education is increasingly targeted in cyber attacks. In fact, some people say the education sector is the most vulnerable of all sectors in terms of such attacks. And another related problem with security is, of course, cyberbullying. About 40% of countries have some plans, maybe 60% in the global north, in Europe and North America. And it is interesting that not more countries do that, because they have proven to be effective. The majority of these programs have had significant success in reducing cyberbullying, and yet not enough of those programs are put in place. There are, of course, the problems of well-being related to health. For instance, analysis of children aged 2 to 17 show that more screen time was associated with lower well-being. In countries all over the world, we find that even young children are exposed to 2 or 3 hours to screen time. And yet few regulations and guidelines exist for screen time. Interesting enough, in China, the Ministry of Education limited the times that could be or should be spent with digital devices to just 30% of overall teaching time, because they also recognized with concern what was happening. The amount of time children spend on screens is a growing concern for parents, as well as for health and education practitioners. A survey of screen time before and after the pandemic of parents of young children between the ages of 3 to 8 in Australia, Italy, Sweden, found that children's screen exposure had increased by 50 minutes as a result of both education and leisure purposes. And usually, the poorer and the more disadvantaged the background of the child, the biggest the increase. There were, of course, also differences between countries. Not all countries are the same. For instance, there was from a low of 2 hours or 2 hours and 15 minutes in Switzerland to as much as 3 hours and 40 minutes in Norway. And compared to similar data that had been collected only 10 years before, this percentage had doubled. And such concerns are now intensifying, because before the advent of digital technology, a lot of studies related to screen time were basically related to television, and a lot of self-reporting of how much time children were spending on such screens. Yet now digital technology allows us to monitor with much more precision. And as a result, we can see now much more strongly that the increase in screen time are negatively affecting diet, sleep, mental health, eye health, and so on. So all that generates a lot of concern that is not directly related to education, but indirectly is beginning to take its toll. So considering all those aspects, the report try to summarize these concerns in 4 tensions that appear when we use technology in education. First, the promise of personalization in education and improved outcomes through personalization, and the adaptation that it can afford us, sometimes may be exaggerated because it forgets the social dimension of education and the fact that not all children can learn in an individualized way, or not all types of learning are most suited to individualized learning. The second is the tension I already mentioned between the potential for inclusiveness, but at the same time, the exclusion of many. The third is a contrast between the commercial interest, which is behind a lot of the increase in the adoption of technology, and the common good, especially in the case of education. And the fourth, to which I also alluded, is a contrast between short-term efficiency and long-term costs. So in this very challenging environment where everyone has a view and almost everything seems to have been said about education, the report used this simple schema to frame its 4 recommendations. The first recommendation is basically asking policymakers, when they decide to invest in education technology, to ask themselves whether it is appropriate for the context. A lot of technology has been applied, but as I mentioned in the case of the digital input, without a reform of the curriculum, of the pedagogy, to reflect how students are going to learn. A major artificial intelligence-based system in the United States that covered 25 million children proved no better than traditional teaching, for instance. The second is, and related to that, they need to design, monitor, and evaluate policies on education technology that involve teachers and learners who can provide feedback about what works. Even in the United States, a minority of senior leaders had been consulted in decisions, let alone those at lower levels of the education hierarchy. The third aspect of appropriateness and whether a solution actually does lead to increased learning is whether the solutions are designed to fit the context. A minority of lower secondary school teachers, according to the TALIS survey in 2018, felt prepared to use technology for teaching even after they had been trained. The second recommendation is related to equity, is the use of education technology leaving some learners behind. Unfortunately, the focus on technology is often away from the marginalized, and yet there are solutions. I mentioned before the China example with a simple technology, a similar example in India with satellite teaching for rural schools, improved scores in mathematics and science, and yet such interventions seem to be less taken into account. Given the significance of connectivity, school connectivity, the report also encouraged countries to set national targets for that. And this is a process that was motivated after the Transforming Education Summits that happened in last year in New York, where digital transformation was one of the priorities discussed. But we encourage countries to come forward with a clear set of targets that is realistic, but will also try to equalize opportunities, because we know that even in the world's richest countries, access to the internet remains a challenge, especially when the cost of data is so high. And the third recommendation is to maintain a focus on the digital public good nature of technology. Many of the platforms do not pass such a test, so it is important to have an international consensus about what are the norms, what are the quality criteria for a learning platform. The third recommendation is about scalability. Often, as I mentioned, countries invest in education technology without having estimated the short-term costs and without having the evidence base. It is very difficult, we found around the world, to find countries that have established bodies that evaluate education technology before they invest. The United States has a clearinghouse at the level of the federal government, and that is very interesting because out of more than 10,000 products that were listed and included in that clearinghouse, only 2% had strong or moderate evidence of being effective. And countries invest without even knowing what it will eventually be the cost. A consensus exists that the initial investment cost in education technology is only about 25% of the eventual total cost. And that means countries embark on an investment without actually knowing how much it will cost them in the end. So it is very important to ensure the transparency of public spending, and that becomes ever more complicated when decisions to invest in technology become decentralized, because if central governments do not keep record of products that are effective, one can imagine how more complicated it might be for individual schools. And the final recommendation is that technology should be sustainable. And by that, we mean not only economically sustainable, but also socially and environmentally. On the social aspect, there are at least two things to think about. The first is the growth, of course, in the definition of frameworks of digital literacy, digital skills. The report notes with some concern that outside Europe, many countries seem to be embarking on definitions of digital literacy that are commercial and associated with specific technologies. In Europe, at least with DigComp, there has been a broader link of digital literacy with citizenship, which is a way that we would also recommend countries should go. But sometimes, even with such definitions, it's easy to forget that in order to navigate the digital world, one does not need highly sophisticated technical skills. Evidence using PISA data shows that those with the strongest literacy skills, reading skills, were 5 times less likely to be duped by a phishing email than students with the weakest reading skills. And that is an alarm call, because it reminds us that at the end of the day, all a young person needs in order to be able to navigate the digital world may simply be a good quality education, a type of education that still so many young people are not receiving. Coming back to the earlier points I was making about well-being, safety, and privacy, it is really important to protect learners and teachers. One very interesting statistic from a study of Human Rights Watch, the NGO, showed that 9 in 10 products that had been reviewed during the COVID pandemic were in fact found to be collecting children's data. And of course, that is not in some way directly related to the quality of education, but it shows that education is being used for other ulterior motives. And finally, last but not least, we tend to ignore, downplay, and forget the material and energy implications of education technology. Just to give one example, extending the lifespan of all laptops in the European Union by a year would be equivalent to almost 1 million cars off the road. Having all learners using technology has footprint that we can no longer ignore. So that brings me to the end. So the report has a campaign, Tech on Our Terms. It reminds policymakers that we need to keep learners' best interest at the center of a framework that is based on human rights. We need to invest in learning outcomes, not digital inputs. And at the end of the day, digital technology should not be a substitute for, as some of the artificial intelligence technologies seem to be suggesting, but a complement to human interaction. But that's exactly what the message of the campaign invites policymakers to think a bit more deeply about. So I come to an end. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mano. Thank you, Manos, so much. Very interesting data. I think a lot of us can relate to many things that were said here. But I would like to open the floor for any questions or comments that you might want to have. It will take some time. Burcu, I think you need the mic though, so just 1 second. Thank you. We'll turn the camera to the person who's asking in 1 second.
Thank you so much. It's Burcu from Turkey. Thank you for the presentation. Well, I don't know if you included in the report, but I wonder the discussions regarding the ChatGPT and the homework. It's a huge discussion now going on in Turkey. Some colleges decided to do a kind of framework on how to use it in the school, and they accepted it. And some totally refuse it. So I really wondered international discussions regarding this, or you have any data or discussion in the report. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I thought there might be some other question. So artificial intelligence was the challenge, the equivalent challenge we faced, like at the time of the inclusion report, the COVID-19 crisis, where we realized that all attention would focus on artificial intelligence at the expense of all the other important ethical and policy questions that technology is bringing. Our view was to say that artificial intelligence is only exacerbating the challenges that already were there. So in that sense, it is not creating a new challenge, but it's simply making some of the needs that we already had more acute and more important to act now. I mean, before we reach the case of homework, obviously, artificial intelligence's main use is through the opportunity to personalize learning much faster. Already a well-known facility that exists on the web, the Khan Academy videos that are quite popular in some countries, have now teamed up with artificial intelligence, with OpenAI, to accelerate the speed with which feedback is provided. But essentially, it's the same problem. It's just more, or opportunity, of course, depending on how one sees it, only more at a more extreme level. Another opportunity, of course, is assessment. The opportunity to use massive texts to automatize the marking of texts, which again, to some extent, has some potential, but it will take much longer for that to be possible for other languages than English. And I'm not sure entirely whether the findings are necessarily that conclusive as to the quality of the feedback provided. A third is the opportunity to have assessment online with proctoring systems that have been introduced, which monitor movements to prevent cheating. Of course, that application started even before, with maybe not as advanced artificial intelligence, but the testing, the opportunity that large language models have shown to show whether people have plagiarized. Again, an interesting application that has proven quite useful, especially looking at politicians' PhD theses and how they, whether they were original or not. And now, to come to ChatGPT and homework and exams also, we know that even a country like Norway switched off the internet at the time of its examination to prevent cheating through the use of ChatGPT. So clearly, education systems need to adapt to that reality. And teachers need to be trained to be able to understand the responses. Now, there is also a concern that the speed with which these tools are developing may make even the ability to understand whether an AI tool has been used or not much more complicated in the future, maybe impossible. So that brings us to your question. how do we then bypass that? Because clearly, in some ways, it can be a tool, and that's also the title of the report. It can be a tool that can kind of help us be more creative, save time doing some more menial tasks in drafting, and then being able to test our thoughts and be more original. But the other question is whether many people are able to use such tools in such creative ways, and maybe the majority are using them in a way that actually close their way of thinking, remove certain layers of thinking process, and in fact deliver a worse quality education. So these are big questions. As I mentioned, we did not go into future-oriented questions too much because the nature of the report is to look at questions related to SDG 4. There are many others who do that, looking into the crystal ball of the future. I don't think we felt as reliable as a source to give good responses. But it is the case, like overall with technology, I think what technology somehow does is to question the way we're doing things. And in that sense, if education systems are ready to look in the mirror and think beyond exams, beyond old ways of doing things, it may be an opportunity for adjustments that will transform the way we think of education. So that indirect impact of education, not the direct that we are scared of, but the indirect, they need to be smarter and deeper into how we view and define education, may be ultimately the greatest gift that technology can give. I mean, we can also think of how many young people today have potentially access to so much more knowledge sources than we had as learners with one textbook, where everything was considered to be the source. So as with everything, technology has opportunities and challenges. It will be interesting to see, as you said, if in Turkey different institutions follow different policies. It will be quite interesting to learn lessons from that and to have research that can inform us sooner or later what is the right course of action.
Thank you, Manos. Andrea, pass the mic. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to read the report. But one of the things that intrigued me a little bit, and what I like that you mentioned, is that a lot of technology is produced, but not necessarily for the purpose to be used in education setting or for learning. And there is a really low number or percentage of technologies that are being assessed or tested before they enter the schools. And then certain recommendations and measures regarding policies that need to be created so we can control or at least follow how technology is being used. Maybe I had the wrong impression, but sometimes I feel that all the burden and responsibility is again on education system and education policy makers. So I'm just curious, were any thoughts or discussions, or maybe there is something in the report regarding possible policy actions that are targeted at industry and increasing their kind of responsibility and role in this whole process? I'm aware of the whole market politics and how it goes, but just in a sense, who needs to decide how it can be used in which terms, or is it up again on schools and school principals and teachers to see how will they use it and for what purpose? Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and the report notes that in much of the discussion on education technology, the language that is being used is more the language of business and less the language of education, and that in itself is worrying. Also, what we see is that even reputable institutions have been using a language that seems to put, as you say, the burden on education, that education is slow in innovating, is slow in moving, is slow in learning lessons. So again, putting all the pressure, the psychological pressure to adapt for the sake of adapting. So that is a major problem, and I think one has to stand in defense of education. Education is not foolish. I mean, it's a social institution. It responds to needs, and if resources are used for purposes that do not improve learning, then they will be at the detriment of everyone. Now, you ask the question about the responsibility of the industry. It's definitely a very important question. The problem is that the power of the industry, especially as it has concentrated in very few actors, is so strong, which coupled with the appeal that technology has on policymakers, the idea that it's shiny, it's trendy, it's important to show that you're not behind, and it's also very carefully marketed. As I was saying, it's interesting how, while no one would deny that we need to know about technology, the fact that we do not need to learn through technology, that is a very different question, is never been clear. It always appears as if it's one and the same. And yet the application of technology has to be evaluated on its own merit. Does it improve learning? Prove it. Now, of course, not everything can be based on evidence. I think it's also important to recognize that there are limitations, and sometimes even if we prove that the product improved learning, that doesn't mean necessarily it is a good investment in the long term, because it has other consequences, it has other costs, it ties certain it ties schools into continuing to use a particular technology, which may not be in the longer term benefit of everyone. So there are so many challenges. Now, whether the industry can be reined in, as we know, it's a hugely difficult question. We know that the European Commission has been giving some type of battle in terms of some of these issues. So I mentioned the GDPR as one of those. But we know that also solutions that try to bypass companies, so the open education movement, has also come across many difficult challenges. It has proven much more complicated to implement an OER policy. The open access or open software is being tried in some countries. In India is an example of a country that has championed open software with some success, but very few countries seem to be ready to invest in that direction. So a very complicated set of questions that you opened up, that I cannot give an answer other than that policymakers need to have their eyes much more open for the benefits of society.
Thank you, Manos. We have two questions. Just pass the mic around. Fiola, can you just pass the mic behind you? Sorry, I don't know the name. Maybe we can take both these questions now, and then Manos, you respond to both of them together. Is that okay? Perfect. Go ahead.
Thank you for presentation. I'm Özge from Turkey. I'd like to ask about that. We see that the adoption rate of new technology is rather slow in many countries, but is there any good example between countries? I think most of the time the more developed countries are the better examples, but is there any examples related to regulations or organizational structure? For example, there are like intermediary organizations who sustain a dialogue between the technological companies and the schools or education ministries.
Përshëndetje, unë do të flas në shqip, besoj kolegja ime do ta përkthej.
I
Greetings,
understand. I understand a little bit. So
Manos
I
is a
understand that.
multilingual person who understands a little bit. Okay, so you think you can understand the question, or let's try.
Let me
Go
hear
ahead.
and I'll tell.
I know.
Need any help, I can help.
Thank you. Jemi duke folur gjatë gjithë kohës për sfidat që sjell përdorimi i ChatGPT-s dhe inteligjencës artificiale. Padyshim që nuk mund të përjashtohet fusha e edukimit, që ka një sër sfidash, shtuar dhe këtë. Sot mësuesit në Shqipëri, po besoj edhe në vendet e tjera të rajonit, janë si ai nxënësi që është i vështirë ose një nxënës me vështirësi në të nxënë përpara kësaj teknologjie, në raport me nxënësit tanë, si e shihni ju të ardhmen e kësaj pune? Pra nxënësit janë sfidues përpara mësuesve dhe po ashtu edhe prindrit edhe familjet. Dhe ndërkohë që ne flasim për një bashkëpunim apo për një partneritet në edukimin e fëmijëve, si e shihni ju të ardhmen e kësaj? Jam e ndoshta keni nevojë për ta përkthyer?
I understand so far, but you will need to do that for everyone else, I guess, who is in the room.
Bravo, Manos.
Okay. Not very much. The idea is that in the education system, the partnership of the school community and the children also, there are so many challenges, and ChatGPT is one of these challenges that we're facing, because it seems that children are a little bit more forward and accepting to these new ideas, but teachers maybe are not so acceptive toward this. And how do you see this challenge working, as there is one step forward to the children and to the community rather than the school system in itself?
Më ka rastisur që me nxënësit e mi të kem dhënë detyra, përgjigja e cilave është marrë nga inteligjenca artificiale. E bëjnë pothuajse të gjithë fëmijët. Natyrisht që e kam pranuar përgjigjen e tyre, por nuk jam mjaftuar me kaq, po e sjell si përvojë këtë. Dhe pyetjet e mia kanë qenë lidhur me qëndrimin e fëmijëve ndaj përgjigjeve që ka dhënë inteligjenca artificiale.
Bringing up an example or an experience that I've had is that sometimes that I've given my students a task or a homework to do. The next day they have come up with an answer that has been already given by the ChatGPT. And of course, I have accepted that kind of answer, but what I have told them is that what has their own input to this kind of task been, or which is their own critical thinking of that, rather than having only copy-paste.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to listen to Albanian after such a long time. A guest question on good countries. The report in the beginning has 7 boxes, the first chapter of the report, from the 7 SDG regions, the 7 global regions, and we selected them in a way that all countries had shown some interest in technology, I mean, in one way or another. But ultimately, I think what we were trying to show is that, with very few exceptions, did these countries really try to ask the question whether technology was improving learning. I mean, the example that historically stands out is the example of Estonia, because Estonia invested in the digital transformation of society and in all different forms, not just across the public sector. So it was a normal extension to apply technology in education. But I think that even in that case, there is relatively little evidence that even Estonia, despite the relatively seamless application and use of technology and the data that generated for policy, at the end of the day, even the fact that Estonia was doing well as an education system does not seem to be particularly related to technology, but more of a drive in society to make the public sector more efficient, and as a result, the schools as well. In most cases that we found, I mean, we also have another example which is quite well known. Uruguay is an example of a country that has been heralded as having championed technology. For that reason, in fact, we launched the report in Uruguay with a partner that has been driving the reforms for the last 15 years. But ultimately, what we also discovered there is that the reforms were actually less general, more partial, and increasingly, the country is essentially trying to move out of the focus on digital technology. In fact, what caused the focus of that country on digital technology was a failure of one laptop per child approach that made everyone think, okay, how can we actually justify the investment that was made and find a better way for the application of technology in education. But even now, the system moving out of digital technology or making it really work simply as a tool for other activities that try to deepen the curriculum and experiential learning and all that. But we had, I don't know, examples like Egypt, for instance, that has invested heavily in education technology, but with the hope that it will overcome a major challenge, which is rote learning, which many education systems suffer from, and yet it's clear that no improvement has taken place in that respect. Still, learners have not avoided that pedagogical approach because it takes so much more than just simply introducing digital inputs in the classroom. Now, your last question was also about dialogue, which I think is very important, and it links, I think, to the last question. You know, which education systems promote a dialogue on these questions? And this is the struggle, and I think that's also what our report tried to encourage. It's not very common to have dialogue because the voices of those who want to see more technology applied in classrooms is so much more powerful and so much more dominating the debate. I can also say I'm from Greece, so I noticed something quite interesting. The latest Minister of Education in Greece actually was, for the previous 3-4 years, Minister of Digital Transformation. His first declaration in Parliament when he was elected was to say that education will become the most digital sector in the country. And that was about 2 months ago. Since then, no such other proclamation has been heard. Probably he even realized, yes, maybe we can make some progress in some bureaucracy, but ultimately everything else is questionable. There is still a debate about smart whiteboards in classrooms. He made a commitment that all classrooms will have smart whiteboards, but we know that they have not been used even in richer countries effectively. So it is such a huge expense with very, very questionable results. So I think the dialogue really is up to communities and organizations like yours that can mobilize people to ask the questions at the end of the day. It's not, nobody denies that there are advantages from technology, but we need to be smart in applying and getting the best out of it without getting ourselves digging a hole for ourselves.
Thank you very much, Manos. I'm just looking around the room. Yeah, I think I could maybe make just if there's no other questions, I wanted really to to refer to this comment on the use of licenses in the US that you pointed out to, which is actually what, and then you mentioned the whiteboards in the end. This story about the whiteboards, I have been listening to for 20 years, I think, when the first whiteboards came, and all schools in Croatia at one point got them. I think it was 2002 or something like that, maybe 3. And nobody ever used them. And it's not only the waste of money, but it's also the sustainability that you point out with the laptops as well, which I think is really critical, and we need to think about it. And I'm just thinking from the point of view of our advocacy, what we can do is this. What is it? Your tech? How does it go?
Tech on our terms.
Tech on our terms. Yeah, you always have the best. But yes, tech on our terms. But it's also about. And it is a fight, I guess, in a way, also about the industry and how do we communicate with them, and who has the power in the society to decide what will happen. Is it the politicians or is it the businessmen? And unfortunately, I think we still live in many countries where actually it's the business that runs the things, although it doesn't, not on paper, but somehow behind the papers, I see a lot of nods. Any final comments for Manos or questions? Maybe. Thank you very much. It was great having you, Manos. We always enjoy your talks, and it's great data. Global Education Monitoring Report is always a thing that we all must read when it comes out. We find it so useful, although often our policymakers say, but it talks more about Mexico than it talks about Croatia. And this for them is always like, it's not about us. But I think from our point of view as policy analysts and people who are dealing with policy, it is very important that we actually try to explain why what happens in Mexico is important for us. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your presentation. And we're looking forward to a next opportunity.
Thank you so much. Falem date.
Bye. Next time in Tirana live, yes?
I hope so. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.